being a murder comedy.
Yeah.
Well, we started with being a murder comedy.
Okay, so we just started, but Mike, did you just call it Ratatouille?
Sure. I don't speak French.
And on that note, folks, welcome to our March edition of the American Praetorian live stream with the usual cast of degenerates and Christopher Ruocchio.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me.
Christopher.
Yeah, no, it was the coldest of opens. That was pretty awesome. We learned that Mike can't say Ratatouille, which is cool. So,
There's a lot of things he can't say. And a lot of things he won't say.
You should be more worried about the things that I will say.
Yeah, you're not allowed to say them anymore, though. Now we're live.
I've seen the look on Mike's face at some of the things a couple of our guests have said. So
I'll be ready.
So, Christopher, you have come home to ban. That is good news.
Yeah.
Tell us about your book series.
Yeah.
You started working on that a few years ago, and now it's like a whole big deal.
Something like that. Yeah, no. So I read a series called The Sun Eater. Sun Eater is sort of a science fantasy, kind of in the tradition of Dune, rather. Sorry, or Star Wars. Since we're talking about Bane. But it's set 20,000 years in the future, not a galaxy far, far away, and it follows a young man named Hadrian, who is a nobleman. He gets stuck in the middle of a war between said empire and the first aliens who've ever really threatened it. It's kind of got a Rome versus the Huns kind of thing going on in space, and it's written like a memoir. He tells you page one, he's the man who ended that war and dealt with the aliens, stories why and how, and about all the things that didn't make it into the official history. There are 5 books out now. Empire of Silence is the first one. They were all published by Daw. Daw and I had some disagreements about how many books there were going to be, and I won that argument and have 2 more books, both of which will be coming out with Bane. And the next one, Disquiet Gods, is, God help me, almost done. I have 2 chapters left, but it'll be out April, I think, next year.
Yeah, Dahl had an argument with existing too. So
yeah,
it is an unfortunate situation. That's for sure.
Yep. At least you're back with a publisher that wants to put the new books out.
Yeah, that I did land far better than a lot of the other writers that I have spoken to about the whole situation. Yeah, it's just, I mean, corporate stuff is never pretty, right? So
if anyone, following along at home isn't following along with the publishing industry drama, the publishing industry is going through some turmoil right now. The world is changing. The market is changing, and nobody is really sure where things are going to go or how things are going to turn up. So a lot of places are struggling to adapt, and nobody really knows what the next thing is going to be. And some places maybe aren't making the best choices, like that.
Yeah. Well, the short version, right, is they got turned out by Penguin Random House, and they had to find a new owner, and they sold themselves to Astra Publishing House, and new owners had some new ideas about how things were going to be done, and so things just didn't work out. I had been told 2 more books, then they told me 1 more book, and it had to be 1 more book, and I had already written about what turned out to be about a third of book 6. So I thought it was about half. Book 6 has not been kind to me, but it was.
Sounds like talking to Pete.
Yeah. I didn't want to have to throw away, months of work, so I went elsewhere. Fortunately, Tony snagged the last 2 books, so saved the series, which is all pretty awesome.
Yeah, and it's not just the traditional publishing world that's facing issues lately, as we went into at some length on this stream last month with Larry and Nick and Jason.
Oh, we went into everything with Larry and Nick and
Jason.
Yeah.
That's the nature of having a conversation with Larry, Nick, and Jason. And really just about any of these streams, come to think of it, we don't tend to stay on topic all that well.
Yeah. So you've been warned, Christopher.
All right, I can handle it. I'm ready.
The indie
Thank you.
guys who think that it's going to be a straight shot for them now, well, you should watch the replay of last month's stream. You got your own set of challenges ahead of you. So
Yep.
don't get complacent, guys.
Was
Robert,
that about the
reason
AI
that Bane
stuff?
can do
Or?
Go ahead.
Sorry. Were you guys talking about like the AI stuff, or what's going on with
We touched
that?
on that.
That was part of it. Yeah.
But also, just one of the things we touched on too is that, just going indie, and yeah, anybody can publish a book, but that doesn't mean anybody's gonna read it. It's even harder to get your work noticed. You're in a very big ocean of other.
Oh, sure.
And you're a very small fish.
Yeah, so it's a whole new world, and nobody quite has gotten it figured out yet.
Yeah, that had been my sense. I always wanted to be trad pubbed, and that was because I sort of figured, one, I would have to figure out how to do marketing, which turns out you have to learn anyway. But I also sort of figured that the pond was getting bigger, faster and faster and faster. And a lot of the early, indie guys sort of already made it, right? So they're kind of baked in. If you're Craig Allenson or whoever, you've got your audience. But there's like a generational element to, these new technologies. And I just figured, smaller pond, right? So I sort of set my sights on the trad pub thing. Of course, that has its problems.
Different kinds of books work better for indie too.
For sure.
Where the market's kind of settling on for the time being is they like maybe shorter books, or they like a whole bunch of them. They write them in a stack and then just release them one after the other. And some of them are kind of more like novellas, depending on who's writing them. But it's kind of in the pulp serial model, But what you're trying to write there maybe wouldn't have worked so well for that.
Yeah, no. I had that thought too, right? Because it takes me, a year plus to get one of these done. Of course, these books are longer than I would like them to be, right? So at this point, it's sort of, 6 books into the series, if they came out half-sized, I'd have a riot on my hands. But my instinct is that these books are getting to be too long. So, hopefully in the future things will shrink down. And we can try different things. Because I've done a little indie stuff on the side with like novellas to prop up the main books. Because of course, trad pub is also slow, right? So there's an argument to be made for doing a bit of everything. So,
and I've found in a large part, being predominantly indie, and the small press that I do work with, namely Wargate, is essentially we're still working on a very close to an indie timeline. There's only so long I can make them because I've still got to keep up. And
right.
I'd love to be able to go back to writing just 2 books a year and make a living at it, but on this business model, it's not going to happen.
No, you basically have to treat it like a blog, but with quality.
Yeah.
I
don't know. A lot of people do it without the quality.
I was to say, you don't have to include the quality from some of the things I've seen, but
it depends on your
genre
and your audience.
But hey, Chris, with the longer books, at least if you get a movie series out of it, the last one's going to be broken up into 2 parts. So
that's true, yeah, man. Or or the first one now with Dune, right? So see how many we can wring out of them. It was supposed to be 4, and now it's 7. So kind of already done a little bit of that.
So 14 movies is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, which is great. It's like a regular. It's half of an MCU. So
15 because they're going to break the last one into 3.
No, it just man, like what happened to cinema, right? Like everything is just really just TV now. It's so disappointing.
Well, movie theaters were closed for a year, and then we got an entire generation, 2 generations now, where the younger half of the millennials and the Zoomers are all recluses who don't like being around other human beings, so they want to sit home and stream. That's what
I guess I just don't get the limited series thing. It's a completely different pace from film. But I'm getting off topic. Sorry.
It's all right.
That happens.
I've already told these guys that I can make the stream go for 6 hours just by getting you 3 going off about Tolkien. So.
Oh yeah, that would do it.
Yeah. So Christopher, since the title of this stream is about world building, Where did you start from with Sun Eater?
That's really a good question. I started writing when I was like 8 or 9 with like the intention of being a writer at some point in my life, right? So I started pretty early, and I started just sort of, I was a kid, right? So I was like filing serial numbers off things and just doing, my own version of whatever it was I was watching or reading at the time.
It's 9-year-old Christopher dreaming of eating the sun.
Yes,
That's where the
delicious.
dream began.
Yeah. So there's not really a clear moment, right? You got like Robert Howard talking about Conan like walking across the fields at Cross Plains and telling me I had to write his story. There's not anything like that. But as far as like this version, there was a moment in college where I was like, okay, like we're getting close to graduating. You have an English degree for some godforsaken reason. You need to like do something. So I sort of cleared the decks and I started over, and I knew I had to do something different. I had been writing something that sort of looked like Empire of Silence, but it wasn't quite there yet. And I needed to change something. What I changed was moving from third person to first. And that sort of informed a lot of the decisions that kind of followed, right? Because usually you go to conventions and you have panels like about world building or about whatever, and a lot of the times there aren't panels about more basic questions like medium, like what kind of story are you writing? And if you're writing a first person story, a lot of things are off the table. You can't do multiple points of view, right? Where there are ways to do it, but generally speaking, you can't do multiple points of view. And that limits the scope. You can't do the sort of wide angle cinematic like battle scenes because you can't just jump from place to place or whatever. You're stuck in one person's head, and that informs a lot of the decisions that you need to make. Because I've done a little bit, especially early on when I was building the setting, sort of wide angle world building, like these are planets that exist, whatever. But as things go on, you realize that a lot of world building is actually wasting your time, and it's kind of a separate hobby. It's a related hobby, but it's not the same thing. And so, being stuck in the one character's head, I didn't need to understand things he didn't understand, to the umpteenth degree. You need enough to like make it work, but you don't need to go to figure out, like where all the individual parts on a starship drive might be if your character doesn't know how they work in the first place, right? It's enough sometimes that these things work. And so the very shape of the story, right, the fact that I went and made this a memoir, sort of took a lot of concerns off the table. It brought a lot of new ones sort of in, because one of the other advantages of writing first person is that every sort of descriptive paragraph is characterization too, because it's telling you this is the kind of character who cares to tell you this. And so that was sort of the big change for me, was just sort of shifting from all of these kind of like early ideas about, I would like to do a space opera, and like maybe there would be these cool aliens or whatever, based on like this culture from history, but we'll like make them weirder, or we'll turn something inside out. But it really started to gel when I made the decision to switch from one voice to another, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because I've done a lot of first person. Probably the close to the majority of mine are in first person. When I do go to third person, with the exception of Black Hearts, it's a very limited third person. Like I'm focusing on one POV character. I've actually kind of combined the two of them with the Polis Group series. I've got one point of view in first and one in third, which so far seems to be working. But
yeah, for sure.
There are definitely some limitations, and at the same time, it definitely kind of frees you up once you do make that switch into, I'm going to look through this character's eyeballs.
Yeah, and the limitations are useful too, right? Because then you have to get creative about solving problems. Like there might be a time where you like really need that second point of view character to do something. You have to figure out, well, how are we gonna make that work, right? Especially, these books are supposed to be documents that exist in Hadrian's time, right? We're reading, an English translation of the book for monks that read, normal English, right, in the future. So these are books that would be, they're written for people in his setting, right? So he like skips over things that he assumes people would know about how like normal stuff works, things like that. Now which is something, I'm a big Gene Wolfe fan. And this is something that Gene Wolfe does, very, very well. I am not Gene Wolfe. I would like to be when I grow up, but but it was thinking about that and thinking about the relationship between the characters writing the story and the text itself that sort of informed a lot of those world building choices, because it needs to make sense, obviously. So you can't just have you can't just use a word that is like modern slang, because it wouldn't it wouldn't have necessarily survived, or for example, right, or something like that. But
Dank needs to survive, though. Come on,
Dank should survive.
Dank should be a sign of like high society. Like only the top nobles and educated people say Dank.
That's such a like Aldous Huxley move, right? Like it's just the sort of
Just don't
slang
want
in
to
the
sit in
Brave
the
New
dank
World.
hole anymore. Oh, come on, Bo. The dank.
These negotiations are busting.
Busted. For real. Oh man, those humor slang is something else.
No, that'd be funny if they see, the historical documents of the internet and they see that as classic language, so they try to emulate that, and so they're just using internet meme speak.
They treat that like Old English, like we treat like saying the and thou.
Shakespeare.
Yeah, no. Well, there is a moment. So there's an orchestra in one of the books that plays an Yngwie Malmsteen song because it is classical music.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yngwie Malmsteen is classical music now.
Anyway,
okay?
yeah, of course, right? But there's no distinction made here. So I'm a huge fan. So it's sort of a nice thing to do. But 20,000 years out, you can kind of smush these things around and put them in places where they wouldn't be, because of course that's sort of what we do anyway, right? Archaeologists will dig something up and they'll be like, oh, this is a sacred relic, and it's like a grocery list. Invariably it's a sacred relic, which is always funny. But that's not new either. I remember there's a story. There was a bunch of, I think they were Assyrian incantations that were written in Elamite, right, which is in cuneiform. They found these old tablets while they're doing construction work, digging around in the Assyrian Empire, and they're like, oh, these are clearly ancient texts, but they were duty rosters from like an Elamite work crew like 2,000 years earlier. And so their spells are like Steve Jackson, right, John Smith, Alakazam, and so it's it's these little sort of anecdotes that you can kind of take and sort of build.
That's how like every cave painting is. It's always like, oh well, this is obviously a fertility painting. And it's like, no, it was just some ancient marine, right, drawing a dick.
Yeah. We have no way of knowing, right? But it's that's one of the fun things that you can do when you play with like these sorts of timescales, right? Because
once you've been at Portageon downrange, cave paintings will never look the same to you.
Well, it's like Pompeii graffiti, right? It's like the
Venus
same
figurines are just them making fun of fat people. It's like, look at the one fat person on the continent. We're gonna memorialize this.
So majestic. Oh man, but no, it's if you've ever read like the graffiti from Pompeii, right? Like it's exactly the same as anything in a rest stop bathroom today. People have changed, at least in some ways. But yeah, no, it's you never know what you're going to sort of latch onto, just sort of reading around or watching movies, TV, documentaries even, and you just sort of spin an idea out from that, or that gets you on a research track. I spent I think half of last year reading about, or was it the year before at this point, about the Persians, because I was just I realized I didn't know anything about it, so about them rather. So the Sun Eater is kind of a kitchen sink series. As long as it is, basically everything I've ever heard of has found its way in there somewhere. So
it's like just a collage of your interests, so you'll never get bored with it, huh?
Yeah, basically, yeah, and that's the thing too, right? So so Hadrian, he's writing the story. he reads a lot, and so this gives me an excuse to pull in any random reference that I might have happened across, which is nice. I won't know what to do when I have a point of view character who doesn't read, so I'll have to limit my my
Just turn them
illusions.
into an unreliable narrator, and all they share is just like rumors that they've heard.
Oh yeah, it's
And the rumors turn out to be like stories from classical literature that he thinks are historical accounts.
Like the moon landing. Wait, what?
Or it's basically the literary version of the aliens in Galaxy Quest.
oh yeah, sure. Where they man, that movie's great.
Or the historical record of the 300 Spartans, but it's the movie.
Yeah.
Yeah, the very accurate, very reliable movie, based on the even more accurate graphic novel.
Yeah.
I like the graphic novel, but that was more because of the watercolor paintings.
Oh yeah, no, it's gorgeous. Yeah, no, I mean Frank Miller's a great writer, but historically, 300 is nonsense. Yeah, so
that was a thing. In the graphic novel, it's very obvious that this is a story told by Spartans to other Spartans to make them motivated to be Spartans. It's complete propaganda, and it doesn't shy away from that. The movie gets too wrapped up with like, look how freaking cool this is, that like it forgets to make that point.
That's Zack Snyder's one move. Is just making things really cool.
You mean they didn't actually have like a goat man playing a lute in the Persian court?
You mean the immortals weren't
ninjas?
Ninjas?
No, yeah, and Xerxes didn't look like that. Yeah.
It wasn't like Xerxes like 5'5" or something.
I'm sure it wasn't that tall. But he also didn't think he was a god.
Worst example of catfishing in history, right there.
Well, the Persians were Zoroastrians, so the god emperor thing wouldn't have been real anyway.
Yeah, no, it's completely. The Egyptians would think that way, but the Persians, it's no, not even a little bit.
Well, just pick the wrong choice, and that's what the Egyptians believed. Like that's pretty consistent throughout history.
If you've ever seen the 300 Spartans, the old 1950s version, it's much more accurate historically and just kind of physically. It still leans into the Spartans represent the West and freedom and liberty, and the Persians represent the Soviets and communism and tyranny.
Sure.
Which doesn't work. But,
if you actually look at the history, it's kind of reversed.
Yeah.
There's a comment says 5'5" back then wasn't a bad height. It's true. Historically, the farther back in human history you go, the shorter people get. Like in the Neolithic age, the average height of a human being was like 3 feet tall.
Well, it also depends on where you were. I mean, the Gauls were laughing at the Romans for being dwarves.
Yeah. Mike, are we sure that 3 foot tall stature, that's just not a kid skeleton?
All of my facts are indisputable.
Especially the bear facts.
Yeah. No, but that's why we named Patagonia, because that was like the archaic Spanish for like land of the giants, because they met people that were like about 6 feet tall. So they're like, wow, these guys are giants.
Yeah, no, they came back with claims as high as like 14 feet, right? And they
well, you got to one up the guy that
diminish
beforehand, yeah.
Well, you gotta make sure that it's a good excuse for having been sent packing when you went into somebody else's territory and they skewered your buddy and you ran away.
Yeah, there's a Roman writer. There's a Roman writer named Vigidius who says at the beginning of his book, it's called De Re Militaria, on things military. He he talks about how did the Romans beat everybody? We're not as tall as the Germans. We don't breed out of control like the I think he attributes that to the Gauls. I can't remember who. And he concludes that it's discipline, right? So then he proceeds to talk about Roman discipline, which is, fascinating. But he acknowledges that the Romans are, and I can say this being an Italian manlets. So, I'm also tall for a 4th century BC Persian. So,
Hey man, Italian is a height in and of itself.
yeah, it has certain advantages. But
it means you can escape easily through the underbrush if you're ever being pursued.
Well, it depends on which forest.
By black riders.
Yeah.
Or
certain forests are less escapable than others. Certain moors are less escapable than others too. Come to think of it.
No, I was at FanX back in September, and I had to take a picture with Dave Butler and Larry Correa, and then Brian Lee Durfee, and it was me, and it looks like the frickin' Fellowship of the Ring photo. And I am maybe barely Gimli.
They needed people of intelligence on that mission quest
thing.
If anybody doesn't know, Dave Butler, he works with band now. He's a band author. He's taller than Larry Correa. He's like 6'8", I think.
He's
got a mustache. He wears a tricorn or a badger hat sometimes. Plays a guitar. He's like a real life bard.
He is a goober, but he's like 6'8", 6'9". So between him and Larry, I clearly am the like Frodo of the Fellowship.
You need to start doing like some forced perspective stuff in your cast photos.
Yeah, we'll make it worse.
Be like that. It could be like that picture of Joe Biden with Jimmy Carter.
Yeah, I'm not a small man, and Dave dwarfs me. But,
it's always funny when there are convention pictures. So I feel like I need to call myself out before someone someone asks whether or not I'm tall for an ancient Persian. So,
well, I mean, who isn't? Just
yeah. Well, barely me. I'm right on the line. So,
well, you know what? That's okay. Not everybody. Being tall has some disadvantages. Like, have you flown like coach lately? It's god awful.
No, I believe it.
No, I'm not one of those pores.
I was too cheap to fly anything else when we were flying commercial.
Yeah.
Right.
The trip over was always better.
Yeah, it was.
So, Christopher, world building. So you said you started with the idea you kind of were inspired by Dune.
Sure.
People kind of like Dune. I only read the books a couple of years ago. Like most people, I'd only seen the awesome movie from 1980.
Masterpiece. It really is.
Masterpiece.
I was introduced to Dune with the Alan Smithy version that was like 2.5 hours and had like book illustrations for the prologue and all that stuff.
I listened to an audio book of it when I was on the road, but it was a fully produced audio book where they had different voice actors for the cast. And
yeah, I've listened to that one.
I thought that was pretty great. I listened to the Dune, Dune Messiah, Children of Dune, and then God Emperor of Dune.
No, my condolences.
It was all right. They got a little weird towards the end there. They got a little weird.
Oh, it got weird.
Oh, yeah. You think the first one was weird?
I've never actually read past the first one. Read that one in high school.
So, I was getting at, though, Christopher, is why don't you tell us what about that inspired you? What did you steal from it? Because we all do it. Everyone's okay to admit it.
Acquire.
What did you extrapolate from that? What did you...
Yeah, so the big contribution is a lot of like basic setting stuff, right? Star Wars was sort of my first science fiction love as a kid, right? I like to say I was like the last like pre-prequels kid in America. We had the laser discs growing up, so I got to watch the unLucased versions, and so I was just old enough to appreciate them before Phantom Menace came out, and I was also young enough to like that. But with Dune, that was like the grown-up version. right? It was, because obviously Lucas stole from Dune too, and far more egregiously, I think, than I have. But
before you beat yourself up about that, if anyone's going to give you shit, just you didn't do a fraction of the stealing that Games Workshop did. So,
there's that too. Well, people think I stole from them, but I have never in my life read or played a single Warhammer 40K thing. I just also have Inquisitors.
if Games Workshop or any other fans ever accuse you or anybody else of stealing, just laugh at them.
Yeah.
Nobody thinks that the stealing from Games Workshop thing is a bigger crock of shit than Games Workshop fans.
Yeah.
That's if there's one thing they hate about that company, it's their over litigation tendencies. So
their protectiveness, their legal protectiveness of an IP that is cobbled together from every science fiction property from about 1960 to about 1989, really.
Yeah, no, it's a grab bag of everything, right? That's pretty obvious from 200 paces, and like that's fine, right? That's totally fine.
It doesn't even have to be sci-fi. They stole Rambo. They have Sly Marbo.
Yeah.
They really?
Yeah.
Holy cow!
Same knife and everything.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
And Coop's right. The character's name is Sly Marbo. Sly with Rambo backwards.
That's that's some real high quality stuff right there.
Yeah, and these are the same people that tried to copyright the term or trademark the term Space Marines and copyright pauldrons.
Yeah.
So
You can't
as
just
in like the
copyright-
actual thing that existed.
yeah, shoulder pads. They fucking
you
Yeah,
can't just
okay.
copyright a word that exists in English. You can't.
And
Well,
they tried to copyright Space Marines and they didn't even check with John Glenn first.
Nice. I did hear about that though, but yeah, no. So Dune was mostly the setting, right? I wanted to do sort of a more adult, more sophisticated sort of Galactic Empire setting. I borrowed the no AI thing because I didn't really want to deal with them sort of everywhere because I want to tell a story about people. Yeah. And when you're writing science fiction, right, you run into the inevitable, or seemingly inevitable tendency of human beings to continue to technify everything. And so you need to come up with a reason not to do that. So I have a very similar in-universe reason to Frank's reason to not have AI everywhere. Although, of course, the thing with Dune, one of the things with Dune that always bothered me was the fact that the Butlerian Jihad was just more or less enforced successfully everywhere all the time, which is kind of impossible, actually, right? If you are covering multiple galaxies, as Dune does, are you telling me no one anywhere has an iMac? Like, that's ridiculous.
Or even like a pocket calculator, it's... But
yeah, there's just
which bet Herbert wrote Dune when computers were like the size of an engine room. So
that's true.
Like it's a lot harder to hide that than it is, your Palm Pilot.
But even so, I mean, the scale renders, as Christopher was saying, the scale renders it unworkable,
implausible. And of course, like they're the Ixians, right? So there's like the one planet that's like, ooh, they're really flirting with the convention. But it never seemed plausible to me that would be enforced universally. So I wanted to, for example, take that aspect of the Dune universe and sort of poke a hole in that, which is which is enforcement, right? It's just not possible. So we have in the Empire in Sun Eater, we have a prescription against artificial intelligence. It's a little bit more specific than the prescriptions in Dune, right? It's just like anything that beeps is verboten. It better be analog in Dune, but mine's a little bit more loose, let's say. But at the same time, we also deal with characters who are sort of between the cracks on enforcement or really fringe cases and things like that. Because again, I just sort of disagreed with Frank's sort of premise here that he could enforce that sort of, or it could be enforced, to scale.
I don't think he gave it that much thought. I think he was just like, yeah, I don't want robots and shit.
Yeah, that was probably it, right? And that's sort of the cool thing about working with earlier ideas is you can make decisions like this. And so I did that. I wanted sword fights, so I have a similar, kind of shield thing, but those have been in a billion things before and after. So, that was another thing. But the general sort of flavor, in terms of warring houses, Galactic Empire, that sort of thing. I wanted aliens. He didn't have aliens. I wanted aliens. Aliens are cool. So I put aliens in mine. So I sort of grew. I did a lot of my building questions sort of by asking questions about problems I had with Dune initially, but then with sort of other science fiction properties and novels as things went on. Like, oh, I don't really like how Star Wars does this. I don't really like this thing that Dan Simmons did, or like that was cool, but like, what if I did this instead, right? Because I mean, we're all science fiction fans, right? And this is, I think, how most of us think, right? We're like, oh, that movie was pretty cool, except for that dumb part. Like, what if I fix that dumb part? What would the story look like? And so I've just been sort of doing that. You do that, enough times, you have a book, right? Or at least part of a book. So that was sort of where Dune started. But then Dune also, there was sort of a thematic difference too, and this is something I've talked about a lot. Frank Herbert's like very cynical about what used to be called the great man theory of history, right? Thomas Carlyle is his theory of history, that history really is, the result of these sort of, individual people and their heroic will sort of shaping and directing the course of everything. A lot of modern historians are like, that's ridiculous, but then they have to contend with like Alexander the Great.
We haven't had a second Einstein.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It turns out actually that you really, you do need these people. Are there other factors like, I don't know, plagues? 1,000,000,000%. But it's silly to just dispense with this. And Frank is so cynical about these individual personalities. He's like, heroes are bad, right? Charismatic leaders are intrinsically dangerous, right? They just become cult leaders automatically. And my problem with Dune is not that it gets weird. I actually love God Emperor of Dune because it's his sort of thesis book. It's where all of his ideas are. And it's just so weird. There's nothing like it. But my big problem with Dune is that in the first book, like, Paul basically is just a hero, right? He avenges his father on his, enemies, and his father is, basically good. His enemies are basically evil, and how, right? Baron Harkonnen is gross. He helps the, downtrodden people of Arrakis to victory. And more than that, they become the conquerors of the universe, and he becomes emperor, and he gets the girl, right? And the previous emperor also screwed his family. So he just wins. We're totally on Paul's page. And then you start building
the prophecy, right?
Well, yeah. And there's also, the prophecies, which are, totally fake, right? They're created by these crazy, space witches, but he also fulfills them and has magic powers, which is cool. And then you start book 2, and then Frank's like, actually, he's Hitler, and you're like, excuse me, where was all the Hitler in? I missed it. And he's like, oh, it was between the books, and you're like,
he actually in the text literally compares himself to
Hitler and to
Godwin's himself.
Yeah, it's very silly and completely unearned. The second Dune book should have been about the jihad, and if it's supposed to be about the tendency of power to corrupt absolutely, why don't we see that? We just see Paul struggling against the fact that he's hemmed in by social convention, and it's making him evil, right? And like, he's a victim actually of his own legend, and I still feel bad for him, and I am told by the epigrams and by Dune fans on Reddit that I'm not supposed to feel bad for him. And I do. So I wanted to ask. I asked myself, if these sort of great figures are inevitable, what do we do about that? Besides, go on, NBC interviews in the '80s and say, well, power corrupts. Like, of course it does, Frank. Like, that's true. Sure. But like, what do we do about that? What do we do with that? And so I wanted to ask sort of the next question, because Dune is a deconstruction story, right? It's sort of its own Last Jedi, and I love it. I like, Dune's a great novel, but it is its own Last Jedi. It deconstructs Paul by the end of Children, and Paul is himself sort of a deconstruction of John Carter, basically, right? He is John Carter. He's a guy from a far off land who comes to this place, insinuates himself with the natives, and becomes king, right? Only John Carter does that. It's just, it's kind of awesome. when Paul does it, it's kind of bad. And I felt like that question wasn't given enough focus actually in those first 3 Dune books in particular, and that was something that I wanted to work with, and that was sort of a touchstone for me starting out with the series. I've kind of like left that question aside. I've been more interested in some other stuff as the series is going on, but that was sort of the first move. So
The longer a series goes on, the more that it tends to deviate from what you initially had in mind.
yeah, no, that's totally true.
It's because you have more time to think about it and you come up with new questions.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And you really, there's that, I think it's attributed to Heinlein, that line about how you need to get your first million words, out of your system before you, figure out who you are as a writer. And I'm at something like, I think about 1.5 million now this far into the series. So I, things have the course has sort of changed, and that's cool. Right. Because now I'm not sort of, just doing, doing with extra bits, which is probably what I thought I was doing when I did the first book, right? And if you ask my detractors, it's the only thing I was doing. So.
Well, the only people in that whole conversation among the people that you shouldn't feel sorry for are people on Reddit. So
that's true.
But yeah, one of the things that you talked about that in Dune in particular, as I'm trying to get the brain going to think of what I was going to say now, was some things kind of went unexplained, and I've read arguments of how they actually weren't unexplained, but it's never really explained in the text how Paul can't control the jihad at all, and how the population of this one planet somehow manages to get off of the planet, even though he controls the Spacing Guild and goes on this unstoppable rampage across the entire galaxy and killing billions, even though he could just tell the Spacing Guild, don't bring them.
Right.
Right? Because he's the emperor.
Yeah, there's clearly a missing book, and possibly like 2 missing books, right? Yeah, between Dune and Messiah. And I know Kevin Anderson and Brian Herbert have gone on to write those, but I don't think that those books really engage with this question either. They're sort of interested in wrapping up some loose ends from the original book with Margot Fenring and things like that. And so I just don't know that. For all of Frank Herbert's talk about this being his theme, I don't know that it's really focused on. He's really interested as the series goes on in like solving the problem of power and central authority, the problem of central authority. And his solution is become a worm man, live for thousands of years, and give humanity a sort of race memory about how bad of a dictator you were, so that they don't do it again. And that is an answer, Frank. Yeah. But how are we going to get the worm man? Like step one on the golden path seems a little impossible. So
Mike, get Kathy on that.
No comment.
She assures you she is harmless.
But something else you mentioned that actually kind of ties back in with world building is you didn't want AI in your setting because AI complicates things, and it does. Here's the trouble with trying to write a space opera is even if you take into account the fact that Moore's law isn't really a thing anymore, processor speeds are not doubling every other year, right? Anymore. That whole win that
it would if the cryptocurrency guys wouldn't buy up all the fucking graphics cards.
The advancement of computers has kind of hit a plateau for right now, it seems like.
Yeah.
But even still, things are kind of advancing. And I don't think we're going to see what they think is a technological singularity. I'm a lot more pessimistic about this stuff than some of the techno-optimist nerds are. But when you're talking about a time scale of hundreds or thousands of years like Dune was, it's very possible that in that long of a time frame, life may be even more unrecognizable to us than the modern world will be unrecognizable to somebody 10,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And it gets to a point where that's just kind of hard to write because how do you even picture that? How do you make it something that the reader can identify with,
Yeah. Well, you run into this problem in other genres too, right? Oh, sorry, man.
Go ahead. I was going to say, wasn't that like his reason for writing Dune the way it was because he wanted to focus on human evolution and how society evolved rather than how technology evolved. And then it turns out it's a feudal system. So
It is, because it is an interesting question. Like, how would society evolve over thousands more years with modern understanding of science if we just remove the computers from it? Because we don't know, because we haven't been around that long with the knowledge we have, but without computers, right? But it gives you a lot of wiggle room to work with.
Yeah.
He was also kind of cribbing from the Muslim conquest of the Persian Empire at the same time too.
Yeah.
So he was stealing history that didn't necessarily fit the scale he was dealing with. I think Christopher, you and I talked a while back a little bit about how he didn't stick the landing on what he was trying to say for precisely that reason. That it's like this is a hero this is a callow youth gets stabbed in the back, comes back, and becomes the hero story. That's all it is. So, and again, I haven't read any of the follow-on books. I did see the Sci-Fi Channel miniseries of Children of Dune, which I don't remember much of. Except
it's pretty decent actually.
yeah, for the budget and the time, it wasn't that bad.
Yeah, no, the scripts are pretty good.
The site, at least, again, just going off of the miniseries of Dune itself, it's about the closest to the book that has actually been put to screen, even more so than the recent part 1 that we've only seen half the book of.
I rather like the new one. You know, they didn't.
I like the new one too.
Yeah.
Really, it didn't have a battle pug though.
That's true. That was a loss.
Have you seen the original '80s one?
Yeah, I took a full star off my review for there not being a pug.
Yeah, Patrick Stewart runs into a gun
it.
battle holding a pug in his hands while shouting for Duke Leto.
It's so good. It's that is the one problem with the new film is everything is so sort of Spartan. All the sets are very empty. The costumes are very sort of
it's like watching an art film rather than a story play out.
It's like weirdly like Elizabethan theater, right? Like all of the sets are just kind of like blank, and like what's there is cool, but I'm like, why is there one chair in this library, Denny? Like where do people sit to read?
Everybody has anti-gravity floaty things. They don't need chairs.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
Except only Baron Harkonnen seems to actually use one.
Well, it's because he's on Medicare, so he's got like the Disability Act.
The far future mobility scooter.
Dude, Dean Prime is basically just Walmart in the future.
Oh man, that's one of my big bones to pick with all 3 adaptations of that book, though. He does not fly. It just carries him a little bit. He just kind of like, floats just right off the ground.
Look, man, if we're going to spend that much money on a cable and harness system, we're making him fly.
We're making him fly. Yeah, I get it. It's like, it's cool, right? He floats up into the air. He's got this long robe. That's kind of neat.
The way suspensors were described in the book, though, there's no reason he couldn't fly.
Sure.
Nothing was given in there about there being an altitude limit on him.
That's true.
If you can lift him up 3 feet, you can lift him up 6 feet. I mean, it's.
Yeah, no, you're not wrong. I just haven't seen anybody like actually do that part of the text.
But in the text itself, it said he even had like little ones under his jowls and stuff, though. That might have looked a little silly on camera.
That's probably true.
Oh yeah, because the first Dune movie was trying to avoid looking silly.
No, man.
Just ask Sting.
Ask anybody in the only person who doesn't look silly in the original movie is I think Kyle MacLachlan. So everyone else is they did something weird. I have no idea why the Bene Gesserit are bald. I don't know, man. David Lynch was up to he's David Lynch. He's up to
drugs, Christopher, drugs.
Yeah. Of course, it's not as bad as the Jodorowsky movie that fortunately we were spared.
Everybody's like, oh man, we could add something great. I was like, no.
Did you read about it?
About this?
Like,
no.
Everything about it is bad.
Have you ever listened to Jodorowsky talk about anything?
He's completely
insane. That man's head is bad.
He like forced his 9-year-old son to like train in karate for like 15 hours a day and for this movie that never even happened. It's completely bananas, just completely bananas. The only good thing was Orson Welles maybe being the Baron. That would have been pretty cool. He wouldn't have even needed makeup, you know. But
He's the best stage in his career.
yeah. But anyway,
So this is one piece of advice I will give readers or potential writers, struggling writers, wannabe writers for writing
that
a
all of them?
science fiction setting, right? There's a temptation out there. You're gonna try to. I want to make this realistic. I want to try to make this thing. There's a whole subgenre out there of hard science fiction, and there's a bunch of people on the internet and corners of Reddit having a big nerd argument over whose science fiction is harder and what constitutes hard science fiction. It's all stupid, right? Not because there isn't merit to writing hard science fiction, right? But the assumption
Boring.
can be, yes, but the assumption a lot of hard science fiction makes is that all because something is theoretically possible or is not explicitly outlawed by the laws of physics, then it can happen, right? And that leads into a lot of assumptions that are no less fantastical than stuff you see in straight space opera schlock.
You mean we're not going to have atom-sized microtech or nanotech or any of that bullshit?
Or megastructures that are so big they wrap an entire star. Or
Didn't Dyson come out and say that the Dyson sphere was BS?
well, he meant it as a swarm, like so much stuff built. But even then, that would take thousands of years to build. So you got to think about the timeline.
And multiple planets.
Multiple solar systems, really.
Yeah.
If you're looking at the scale.
But I've seen like one series of, there's a YouTuber out there, I cannot remember his name, but he's a physicist and he's a sci-fi nerd, and he likes to talk about
Isaac Arthur.
Yes, Isaac Arthur. But he's a techno optimist, and in some of his videos, he seems to just take it for granted that nanotechnology is going to be able to just replace brain cells as you age, so you'll be able to be not quite immortal, but effectively, like people will be able to live for hundreds of thousands of years. Like, just take that as a given. Like, you don't think that's like really? Now, granted, he's a physicist. He's not a neuroscientist, right? But I've talked to neuroscientists about this, and I think one of them's in the chat. Like, we don't even know that this is possible, much less if it's something that we just take for as a given, right? Or even if it would be a good idea, even if it is possible. So just pick a tech level that makes your story work and makes you happy, and hand wave away how it got there from that. That's my advice. If you want to write hard sci-fi, go ahead. Go for it. But you're never going to make the most autistic nerds happy.
Yeah, well, basically every sort of nerd argument boils down to like, the Superman versus Goku thing, right? You can just make an argument for basically anything, right? So like, don't worry about it. Just make decisions, right, for how you want your story to be organized and be internally consistent. Yeah.
You know what sci-fi inspired more people to become real astronauts? Star Trek.
Right, the one with the replicator and the beaming technology. Yeah.
Yes.
It's so realistic. I don't know, like you Star Wars nerds, like you just don't know real science, man. You can teleport, it's fine.
Star Trek is always the more serious one, and Star Wars is the fantasy one.
Right.
Because Star Trek, every problem can be solved by just reversing the fucking polarity, and it's space magic. They just don't call it that. Whereas in Star Wars, they call it the Force.
Yeah. It's all obviously silly, right? And the point isn't, that you don't need S foils in space. The point is that banking looks cool, right?
That doesn't make it bad, though, right? Like even in Dune, the way prescience in Dune is a huge influence on the story. Like Paul's entire mental breakdown he goes through because he keeps seeing all these horrible visions of the future, and he doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know how to change it. He doesn't think he can change it. Well, how can you have visions of the future? It doesn't make any sense. Well, he can, and it's necessary for the story. And they combine like mysticism and a little bit of techno babble about waveforms and such, and it just works. It works for the story. The important thing is you decide how it's going to work in your story and just pick a set of consistent rules. But also, this is where a lot of guys struggle, I think, is you really got to think out the implications of this existing, right? And I don't want to say a lot. I don't read that much anymore, so I really can't say what, the writers are all doing these days. But you got to think about how this particular gadget existing would be used for other things. And the classic example you see in space opera is like the artificial gravity in ships. We've had it since they've been putting space on television because it's hard to simulate zero gravity on television, right? Well, if you can make gravity a constant acceleration force, does your ship still need to be propelled by big rocket engines? Why? It's right. What will be all the other applications for this? Why can't people just hover around like they can in Dune? Why do they need?
Because then they would fly instead. Chris just brought it up.
Exactly. Well, like even in like Star Trek, right? Like in one of the movies, they had a dune buggy with wheels. It was the first time anybody saw a wheel in Star Trek.
That was entirely because Patrick Stewart wanted to drive a dune buggy, and he wanted the studio to pay for it. So he's like, we need to put this scene in there.
Especially once it got into the later movies, everything was self-indulgence.
Oh, yeah.
But, and it comes down to things like that. Like if you have super intelligent, self-aware AI that's just commonplace, why are your ships manned? What is the justification for any of this stuff?
Well, I'd say the justification is I want to go over there.
Oh, yeah. Then that's fine.
I don't want to send a robot over there.
But it goes back to what Chris said. It's like S-foils, are necessary, but banking looks cool. If you read like the Atomic Rockets blog and that website, they go out of their way to talk about how obsolete space fighter pilots would be, right? What they don't talk about is like people want to read about space fighter pilots. It's like I'm sorry, but the X-wing pilot is cooler than an unmanned, drone strike on the Death Star. So that's why we want to read it, and that's why we want to watch it. So find a way to put fighter pilots in your story, because
there's all kinds of ways you can justify it too. I mean, I when I really turned my hand back to science fiction, I basically came to this same conclusion that it's all really just fantasy with a slightly different coat of paint. Yeah, because most of the technology not only doesn't exist, but a lot of it can't really if you start drilling down into thermodynamics and stuff like that. So just as long as it's internally consistent, rule of cool is the laws of physics.
Yeah, and in finding those justifications,
better than Star Trek.
But it's in those justifications too that you find like what makes you, right, as a writer, because you could do something, like you just you might want to just write Rogue Squadron again, right? Why not, right? Those books are great. But you might need to come up with a different explanation as to why they still need fighter pilots in X-Wings, basically, right? And it is in that explanation, right? Maybe that's political, right? Maybe there's some weird law of physics that you invent for the story that makes this necessary, or whatever, right? It's a cultural thing, whatever. Those details and the explanations are what really build the setting, right? More than the individual decisions. Because these first decisions will start flipping, second and third and fourth order, decisions that you need to make as a writer. And in doing that, you have a world sort of grow from that place. So one of the big questions you need to ask is what is your first question, right? As a world builder, right? With Tolkien, it was languages, right? I think languages are a really good question because they sort of inform names, and from there you can get a map, and then you can get all these other things. But you usually start with a random idea, right? Especially if you're, writing a book every, every quarter or, semi-annually or whatever, right? You need ideas all the time. And so you can't be too picky about where they come from, but then you have to work from this new idea you have. Maybe you have a scene, or you have a character, or you have like a cool, I don't know, gun, and you wanna go from there. But you depending on the nature of that first question, you end up with very different sorts of story shapes. You don't even need to start with a world building question either, right? You might be, like I said, it might be a character, but you know, these things are sort of all connected. And so if you change how space travel works, suddenly you have to change how. So, for example, in Sun Eater, right? Warp drive exists. A lot of my readers seem confused. They think that it's because it takes so long to get from point to point that we're just doing sort of Einstein, special relativity stuff. It's just that space is that big, actually, right? And even if you're going 100 times light speed, it's still going to take decades to get places. But because of this, I needed characters to, still be alive. When we come back, not so much if they're on the ship because we can freeze them for that, but if they come back home, I don't want to change cast every single time. Although you could actually, that could be a thing that you do, right? That could be a different decision. So I had to come up with, some genetic stuff to extend lifespans and do things like that. So one question sort of leads to another, and as you sort of follow that maze, you end up with a whole setting. But when we were talking too about everything really being, science fiction at least being a kind of fantasy, what's interesting is you see this going the other way, and a lot of fantasy is increasingly becoming science fiction, which I detest. I detest mana points. I detest freaking eating rocks to cast, channel fireball. I hate all of that. I think that TTRPGs have been a blight on fantasy literature, and we should, like, everyone. When I was an editor, people would come up to me,
Gamification.
What's that?
The gamification of character, where it's like you're not acting like a character or a human being, you're acting like a class from a game.
Exactly, right? And I would have people pitch their books to me this way. I'd be like, okay, tell me about your fantasy novel when I was an editor, right? And they would be like, oh, my main character is a half-elf rogue, and I'm like, rejected, leave.
PTFO.
You're my hero.
Yeah, learn to I don't, like, who's your character? I have no idea. You just told me half-elf rogue.
But my magic system.
My magic system. Yeah, no, this is obviously the fault of one specific writer having a disproportionate impact on the discourse, which is normal, right? And there's always, each generation's got a few, but that's not, that doesn't make good fantasy, in my opinion. A lot of people disagree, but they're allowed to. Can't help them. But there is this sort of convergence, I think, of the two genres and the sort of ethos that kind of underwrites both of them.
Chris, what about this? It's a normal person who gets sent to a fantasy world that's based on the game rules.
Oh boy, yeah, no, that's all so much fun.
That's $1 million idea right there, bro.
I like a lot of anime, but to the degree that anime has just become that plot. Oh gosh, this is like, how do you ruin a whole medium? I don't know. No, lit RPG is not one of my favorites. It's sort of the apotheosis of this trend. Like, if I want to play a video game, and I do frequently, I will just play a video game. Books aren't video games, and I would rather not do that. So no, I am militantly against magic systems.
I guess I don't really read a lot of fantasy. Never have. But to my mind, if you're going to have magic, I understand you got to have some rules for it. But if you midichlorian it too much, it just kind of ruins it to me.
Yeah,
I don't know. Yeah,
you can't just do whatever you want, right? But it does become unmagical if you have to, if you're aware of how many spell points Gandalf has. He can't possibly throw a flaming pine cone at the wolves this time. He's out of TP. It's terrible. But at the same
just
time,
wait until he reaches 5th level, okay?
Right, then he can throw 2 pine cones.
I've been grousing about the gamification of storytelling for a while. Some of it goes back to the infamous panel at LTUE a few years ago, where the young lady told the audience that as gamers, they understand what it's like to be in a combat situation.
Oh, that's amazing.
I mean,
Holy
I know what
cow.
it's like to run out of blood points, so it's
Oh
And
my gosh.
Larry was on the panel, and I saw him half face double face palm, check himself, and Jim Curtis and I were in the front row, just going, did she just say that?
You hear the damnedest things on panels. That might be the worst thing I've ever heard, honestly. But
Keep it unlocked, everybody.
oh my gosh!
You just made Christopher's night a little bit worse. Welcome to the panel, bro.
Just when I thought the level of discourse on science fiction convention panels couldn't get any worse. No, the previous winner was one lady once told me that in the Middle Ages, the clergy concealed the fact that choirs existed from the peasantry in order to persuade them that angels were real. That was a fun one. But
right,
yeah,
forget this vape stuff. This is
going straight to the hard stuff. Yeah.
Oh no, he's going to his emergency stash.
The emergency smoke that's come out.
Yeah, no, it's truly.
What you did to him, Christopher?
I'm sorry.
That is about the dumbest freaking thing I've heard about the Middle Ages, and I've heard some dumb shit about the Middle Ages.
Obviously, their first thought wouldn't be, "Oh, there's some people singing that I can't see." Their first thought would be, "Oh, it's an angel."
I was in the right, but like people knew people who were in choirs, right? Like they were in their village. Like it's just so silly. I was sitting in the audience for that one, and my friends had to like hold me down. Like liar. It was. Conventions are an endless source of stress for me for this reason. But like gamers do not know what it's like to be in combat, right? Like why would you ever? Just why?
Because she had no other frame of reference.
Oh, Lord have mercy.
Well, I just want to point out, like, how good were these singers that you hear it and you're just not like, wow, that guy has some pipes to him. It's just like, well, that's an angel. This is supernatural,
The real takeaway from this anecdote is that the quality of church choirs has declined dramatically in the last 1,000 years.
I blame the guitars.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
So cursed.
Yeah, the whole getting back to the whole gamification thing and magic systems, which I don't much care for either. And I actually was talking with Steve Diamond about this a while back, that this systemizing of magic renders it no longer, it's technology at that point.
Right.
There's nothing mysterious about it. And the whole point of magic is that there is a mysterious element, and that is what makes it dangerous.
Well, you know how I always bring up like the etymologies whenever somebody says something stupid, right? Like magic literally means secret knowledge. So it's why we call them magi, and mage comes from the priestly class because they have a secret knowledge.
Well, it's even worse than that, right?
Hang on, guys. Chat, stop trying to traumatize the guest. That's our job.
Oh, are you talking about Jim's question about PTSD visions? Yeah, I've heard that. I wish I hadn't. I wish people would stop saying these things. But they can't be stopped. You can't stop stupidity. It's like gravity. I won't do the
brings us
the
all
Dark
down
Knight
with it.
spiel, but no. What was I saying? I lost my train of thought.
Well, we were discussing magi and
the word magic, right, comes from the word for the Persian priestly class. So it wasn't even your priests were doing mysterious things. It was those weird foreign priests. What they're doing is magic. What we do is religion, right? It tends to be tends to be a rule of thumb. Is sort of a sort of an ethnic othering component. This is a spiel I'm stealing from Dave Butler. I should say, because this is sort of his thing. He wrote. If anyone hasn't read it, there's an article on Bane.com about magic systems and why they are bad. And I had always felt this way, but Dave put it beautifully. I think it's called Against Magic Systems. But I highly recommend anybody read that. If you're thinking about writing fantasy, it will perhaps give you a different view on how you can go about these things, which I think is worth doing, because the tendency too, especially I think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, on the indie side, is to just sort of like pick. There seems to be like a category that's always in vogue, and it's everybody writes that idea to death. And we do that in Tradpub too, obviously, if anyone remembers YA dystopias. But it seems to happen faster in indie for whatever reason, and for the obvious reason.
Yeah.
And
That's where the money is, so that's where everybody wants to go.
Yeah,
Until it's not there.
it burns ideas out pretty quickly. So,
but speaking of like those weird foreign priests doing magic, so I too am suspicious of the Anglicans.
Rightly so.
Rightly so. Oh boy, God help the English.
I'm Irish, so I'm not supposed to express that sentiment.
You're what? I'm sorry.
I'm Irish, so I'm not supposed to even express that.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Hey, which about the last time that the British had the English had a jump in quality was when the Romans took over. So you can thank the Italians for anything good that came out of that stupid island.
That's true. We gave them a little bit of a jump start, and they were at their zenith when they were French. I just saying. And then if anyone is English watching, I actually like Britain's pretty cool. It's just funny to do this. But the Anglicans, on the other hand, right? I'm Catholic, so I can't possibly say anything nice about the Church of England. So except they have some nice buildings. I wonder where they got them.
Yeah. I want them back though.
Yes, I'm sitting here surrounded by 3 rosary twirling Vaticanites, papists every which way.
That's true.
Awful. There's conspiracies to overthrow the nation and hand it over to the Pope. Just going every which way.
Yeah, we were the original conspiracy theory.
Yeah,
that is true.
Especially the Irish and the Italians on top of it.
Yeah. No, those old racist comics where you've got the tentacles coming out from under the Pope's vestments. Those are pretty cool. I'm just saying.
I like the papal tiara alligators that were coming out of the water.
Oh, those are cool too. Yeah,
one of my favorite political comics, and I gotta make like some robotic alligator thing with that design. Because if we're going to take over the world, we need the papal hat alligators.
Yeah, no, 100%. That in the squid, right? We just we build gigantic robot clerical squids, and we take over Washington. It's a foolproof plan. What could possibly go wrong?
And then integralism, finally. But
Vatican III is going to be lit, Mike.
Vatican III, Return of the Pope.
It'd be so good.
Speaking of traditionally pub genres that kind of came and went, there was the teen post-apocalyptic dystopia. That was it Hunger Games that started that, or was it something else? I think it was Hunger Games, right?
I think that was the first sort of big one, right?
And then there was the Maze Runner, and then there was what's it called?
Divergent.
Yeah. And they got made into movie. People made a lot of money off of them, but then it just kind of died. And then there was I remember when there was a whole wall.
Because the actresses got too old.
Remember when there was a whole wall of teen paranormal romance in the bookstore, and then that kind of trying to ride that Twilight money? And then that kind of went away.
Yeah, YA seems to do this a little bit more than adult, traditionally published fantasy and science fiction do.
Well, also need to remember that the average age of a young adult reader is like 32. So
Man, that is so true. I was at a Scott Westerfeld signing because they wanted a local author to interview him, and everybody was like in their 30s. And I was like,
Minimum
oh,
of 2 cats each.
yeah. I was like, oh, the stereotype is completely correct.
I don't.
Which in that case kind of made sense because he was writing a new Uglies book, which was like a thing maybe I hesitate to say the wrong year, like 15 years ago. So it was kind of like, oh sure, like they came back, right? I imagine that if Christopher Paolini writes another Aragon book, my brother will be the first person through the door. And it's not going to be a 14-year-old, but
I don't. I don't understand the fascination with the writing specifically for YA. With a lot of people are reading YA, it seems like that world attracts a lot of drama and a lot of dramatic people. But
that's definitely true.
That's none of my business.
Yeah, it's sort of a parallel industry though, right? It in the same way that sort of indie and trad pub, are kind of parallel industries. It's got a different sort of target audience. It's the people who read Harry Potter and then didn't really read anything else. They just wanted to grow up, still being entertained in the same way that they were when they were kids. So it's sort of a cottage industry, I think. It's a little
and
bit.
How's that working out for them now? Because they all hate Harry Potter now.
Well, yeah, there is.
No,
that.
they hate J.K. Rowling.
Yeah, I know.
That's a whole nother bit of Schadenfreude.
However, there are other, even outside of YA, there have been some trends
Totally.
that are less clustered though. Like there's always been like the vanity rewrite of Starship Troopers has been one, right? Where a middle sci-fi author I'm going to write my own space, military sci-fi novel that starts off with a guy going through basic training. And then
but Armor was really good. So if they want to keep doing that, I'm cool with it.
Oh yeah, no, some of them have been really good. They're not all bad. I'm just saying it is kind of to the point where I've read a bunch of them myself. Some of them are great, some of them not so much, but it's kind of just a vanity rewrite type thing.
As much as I hate to admit it, Old Man's War wasn't that bad. It wasn't great, but it wasn't.
I read Old Man's War in one sitting. I didn't hate it. I'm not gonna pretend that the book was bad just because of who wrote it and his dumb opinions. But
so does J.K. Rowling. But
it was obvious that he had never been in the military, and never been around military people, and he was writing it from a very amateurish perspective on that.
Yeah,
but
because he read Starship Troopers and filed the serial numbers off.
Pretty much. So it does happen. It doesn't mean you shouldn't write your novel that's inspired by something else. Like Christopher was inspired by Dune, right? My work in progress right now, one of the ideas that inspired that was when my wife sat me down and made me watch Jeeves and Booster because she likes watching old British television shows.
And your idea was how can I put rocket ships in this?
Basically, yes. That's my idea for many things,
Well, actually, this is actually a little bit of an announcement because I haven't said anything about this publicly yet. I'm actually working on a Galaxy's Edge novel right now.
Oh, cool.
Nice.
Or the Centurion book. And Galaxy's Edge started with want to write Star Wars, can't write Star Wars, so let's write our Star Wars.
What if the Clone Wars wasn't a giant clusterfuck?
I did try that.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
No, but we say it's filing the serial numbers off, but it's really just it's taking what works and what people want to read and watch and experience, and putting more out there. So
it's also just taking an idea that you like or that you think is interesting and what if I transpose this dynamic into a setting and there's nothing wrong with that. Like every story has kind of been told already. We've been telling stories since the dawn of human history, right? Everything's been done at this point. It's just how you put your own.
Mostly by Edgar Rice Burroughs. So
yes.
Man, that is so true.
Yeah.
If not him, then by the guy who did the Shadow comics, the Shadow books, whose name is
Walter Gibson.
Walter Gibson,
he wrote 25,000 novels. So
machines.
250 some in 5 years.
I was close.
he is a magician, so he's got that sleight of hand on the typewriter as well. So
Um, yeah, I lost my train of thought there.
For
pick it up somewhere.
building your world on that, like where this took me though, is I'll talk about my work in progress. So I started with this idea. So I have like this well-to-do kind of young gentleman of leisure, and he has a personal valet that was assigned to him kind of as a babysitter because he got in trouble as a young man at university, right? And I just kind of took that. Well, what if his story is, some kind of family obligation leads to him going on an adventure that he doesn't feel like he's ready for, but he has to grow up and take some responsibility and finally just, ascend finally to adulthood and actually start doing something with his life, overcome his own lack of confidence in himself. And it just kind of went from there. And the next thing you know, I'm reading, physics papers from 1984 about sensor fields that might hypothetically make faster than light travel happen without causing causality loops, and just spiraled into madness there. So, yeah, one thing can lead to another.
Yeah, and it's just a question of keeping that all straight, right? Whether that's keeping some sort of world Bible or outlining, which I know a lot of people seem to be allergic to, but I think is nearly mandatory. Certainly is for me.
It really helps.
Yeah, boy, it sure does.
And then my problem is that the more I get into it, the more I think of this would be a good idea. That then I really like the idea. Now I have to go back and change a bunch of shit because my new idea is better. And I'm making it a lot harder for myself. I'm past my deadline.
And me too.
Sometimes that can be the advantage to outlining. I actually had to kind of pause this Order of the Centurion thing and outline it in a little more detail.
Oh, I have a very detailed outline for this one, but it's all the story hasn't really changed much. It's all the periphery stuff because I want to get it right. And a lot of the world building does matter for how the story flows. It's not just niggling background details. So, but at a certain point too, though, I want to say this for all the wannabes and hopefuls out there. At a certain point, you got to stop tweaking it, call it good enough, and send that sucker out. And just accept what you did. If you're going to write more in that setting, you just live with it. Don't try to retcon it because people are going to catch that right away. Just live with it, play by those rules you established, and just keep going. Or if you don't like it, write something else.
Yeah, the people who keep reading didn't have a problem with it, so don't try and fix it.
Yeah, that is so true. You'll see that with review numbers, right? The ratio only gets better the longer a series goes on because you've scared everyone else away, right? But yeah, no. Really, yeah, those ideas can come from anywhere, and you can apply them in strange places too, right? So I don't have any combat experience, although I am a gamer.
So you do,
right? Yeah, of course, right. But setting gaming aside, but I have done, I've done like a couple of years of boxing. I did some HEMA, some fencing, and so I have no idea like how to write like naval engagements or anything. Like I'm sort of the anti-David Weber. I just haven't I'm not doing the missile thing. But I can write a sword fight, so I had to figure out a way to like turn my space battles into an excuse to have a sword fight. Right, this was something that I had to do too. So you need to find a way to play to your strengths. And that can come from anywhere. And for me, that was there's a story in the Punic Wars, right, about the Romans being bad at naval engagements. So they invented a boarding bridge that would spike into the Carthaginian ships. I'm like, we'll just all of my space battles will be boarding actions. Thanks, Roman history book, right? Like that's that's maybe a more obvious place.
Your spaceships turn into giant sword fighting robots.
That would also be incredibly cool. I'm sure there's an anime.
A lot of people think so.
No. I did foil mostly. I did a little saber. Saber was usually over too quickly in my experience. Maybe I was just bad at it, or good depending on the engagement, but mostly foil. Epee I did not like. Stop stabbing me in the foot. What's that about? But yeah, no. So mostly foil. Uh,
Did you do
What?
a longsword at all?
a little bit. That was what I did. A little bit of HEMA. I quit pretty quickly. I broke someone's ribs and was like, maybe we won't do any more of that.
That's not
So
HEMA. That's just a fight.
yeah, well, basically, yeah.
Look into my eyes. Do you see the animal inside?
Yeah, I felt very bad
Chris,
about that.
Chris legitimately did study the blade, though. So
I did legitimately study the blade. Yes. Yeah, that meme is actually a picture of me. But no, it was just a long sword when I did HEMA, and then naturally, having broke someone's ribs, I went to boxing, where that never happens. So
Instead, just concussions and broken noses and
sure. It's been a few
I
years,
take it
unfortunately.
you broke the dude's ribs. You were studying Lichtenauer rather than Fiore.
I don't even think I got that far. So
Okay.
it was like I think I went like 3 times, and I was like, ooh yeah, I don't
From
wanna,
what I
do it.
understand, Lichtenauer, or the German form of longsword, is basically boxing with a sharp stick in your hands.
I think that's right, but I have not. I didn't get to I didn't do enough HEMA to like actually start reading the manuals. I
Yeah.
just like showed up for a couple sort of intro lessons, and then immediately decided this is a recipe for disaster.
So you just won too quickly, basically.
Something like that. Yeah. It was a bit of a rough start, let's say. But the point is, right? To get back to the writing, you play to your strengths, right? So I know how to write those scenes, I think, pretty well, and so you find a way to sort of turn the world building right to something that you can do. And that's not to say that you can't write something that's going to stretch you a little bit, but sometimes you can make decisions like this because you need to work with your toolkit as a writer too. So
and there's a certain degree of research that can be done and can help you stretch into those areas. Like I was never a tanker, but I've had a couple of instances where it's like, okay, how am I going to employ tanks in this particular instance? Because guess what? There are tanks on the ground.
Well, let's see.
No,
There is
just
one thing.
go to the War Thunder forums. You'll get all the information you need, classified or not.
There is one thing the internet is good for, aside from pornography, and it is research for this kind of stuff. You can look up there's probably a YouTube video about it. That's actually probably pretty good, and you just might have to sit through an ad for Raid Shadow Legends.
oh boy.
Or World of Tanks.
Yeah, I want to be clear when I said that the broken
Dead.
ribs, doesn't happen in boxing. That was sarcasm, Pavlo Sean.
Well, it doesn't happen if you're bad at it.
That's true. But yeah.
Like
Anyway,
yes, the Chieftain. So there's a whole YouTube video or series about a guy just talking about tanks. He knows what he's talking about. So you can find this stuff if you want to do the research and you want to get your little details right. So it's up to you to how down in the weeds about some of this stuff you want to get. I would say, just as a general rule of thumb, unless you're personally familiar with it, don't push your luck too much, because somebody who is familiar with it will know. And then
the other thing is what's more important, describing the scene and the action the way that it needs to in order to draw the reader in, or showing your work.
Exactly. You're not Tom Clancy. Tom Clancy could get away with that because he was Tom Clancy. That was part of his thing, right? People don't want to read an entire paragraph about how something, or an entire page, I should say, about how the stock market works in your book. Okay.
And a lot of the military stuff that Clancy was writing was actually disinformation aimed at the Soviets.
is that
I was
true?
going to say about the how the stock market works. The economists don't even know how it works anymore. So
Clearly, right?
So, Christopher, think about this. How many first-time authors who had not ever been in the military do you think get picked up for a fiction contract by Naval University Press?
Oh, okay. Awesome. I had no idea. No, that's pretty cool.
It's funny. My wife's father was an officer in the Army, and he was in the Signal Corps. and worked at the Pentagon later in his career. And Tom Clancy just popped into his office one time unannounced, and he kind of called him told him to kind of GTFO.
You mean he's basically in, or
Yeah. The stealth fighters in Tom Clancy were also the same ones that were on just about every toy shelf at that point too.
Yes, the one that everybody thought was going to be there, the
F-19.
F-19. Yes.
I just wanted the USS Flag to make an appearance.
All of us did.
Just like your Christmas tree, it didn't.
Yeah.
But hey, so let's talk about some world building things, though, just for different, because we've written in different genres. Actually, Christopher, I don't know if you have written in different genres. I think you've mostly focused on this one series.
Yeah, unless the one Marvel comic counts.
You wrote a Marvel comic?
Yeah, I did one Thor 10-page short story.
Well, it's automatically better than Ragnarok.
It is better than Ragnarok. It's a very low bar. But no. Steve McNiven is a friend. He likes my books, and we became friends. And he was like, "We should do a comic." So I did one shot. But everything else has been Sun Eater. I have done like 24 short stories, a couple novellas, and then the 5, almost 6 books, and that's it. So everything's been in the one setting.
World building applies primarily to science fiction and fantasy, obviously, because the more contemporary and real your setting is, the less of it you have to do, which is easier, right? If you just go to that contemporary fiction section of the bookstore that none of us go to, where they got books for people who own hotels and stuff, you don't have to do any world building. Not really.
You might have to do research, though, right?
You might, but who even reads those books?
Yeah, it's a mystery to me.
They show up in the public school curriculum a lot,
and in airport bookstores, and somehow they make the New York Times bestseller list because
it's money laundering. Let's be honest.
I got to be honest. From my own perspective, I don't really see the appeal of contemporary fiction. Just reading about a person just going through a problem they have to overcome in normal everyday life in the contemporary world. I live in the contemporary world. I have problems. Why do I want to read about somebody else doing that? I could do that whenever I want.
Yeah, that's been my feeling too. I've never understood that. I don't even like historical stuff if it starts getting too close to now. I just it's gotta be out there somewhere, and I don't know why that is. I need my sword fights, I guess.
Yeah, you're already exposed to contemporary society enough. You don't need to read more of it.
And at a certain point, it just turns into a soap opera, which it's like, okay, I can't bash it too much because people Danielle Steele also has a giant pile of money, right? But it just is not my thing. So setting that aside, for your science fiction or your fantasy worlds or your setting, and it's not just that though. Like in one of Pete's thriller settings, he came up with a kind of a terrorist organization that he kind of was inspired by Cobra from G.I. Joe. So when you come up with something like that, there is some world building required because you got to think about how would an organization like this be able to form and operate in the real world? How would they be able to survive and function? Because the G.I. Joe writers certainly never thought about that. But if you're going to write a novel, you have to. So, Pete, how did you make that work, if you can get into it?
Well, the idea as I eventually developed it was basically, I'm going to make them the real skull behind the mask of the biggest, most popular NGO on the face of the planet. The one that all the multi-billionaires want to be seen giving to, all the politicians are glad handing, and behind it is Hydra, Spectra, Cobra. And so they've got bottomless pockets and they can do pretty much whatever they want. And
that would never happen.
As that series has gone on, the inevitable kind of comparisons to the WEF have started to come out. But I didn't even know about the World Economic Forum really when I started that series.
It's probably for the best that we wrapped up the Dead Six trilogy before all.
I was gonna say, like with Mike and Larry with Dead Six, it was just like, all right, let's just choose the most evil, corrupt politicians possible, make them the bad guy. What do you know? It turns out very realistic, actually.
Yeah.
Now, Dead Six is an example of a kind of contemporary setting that did require a lot of world building, because I said to Larry, we were writing it. Now, I don't want to just do like a normal real world setting. I want an alternate history where China had a civil war and a split and all this other stuff happened. And I kind of had to talk him into it because he thought it was too out there. And
So did some reviewers, apparently.
if I had to do it again, I don't know if I would go that route. But I think it made it interesting because it allowed us to get into some really interesting backstory. And it probably threw some readers for a loop when they're reading this, they think is a contemporary fiction, action fiction novel. And they talk about a third battle of Shanghai with a nuclear weapon. And then they're thinking they missed something in history class for a second.
Then they get into Swords of Exodus and it gets even weirder.
Yes. So
that's not a real country in Russia. That was one of my favorite reviews. It was like there was no nuclear attack on Shanghai. There's no North China and South China. It's like you're quick, you. Yeah.
Good job, Mr. Peabody.
Well, they're readers and readers, right? You know, if he's not accustomed to alternate history because he's just a techno thriller, you know. If he is used to reading techno thrillers, you know, you got chocolate in his peanut butter, I guess. Just who reads those Danielle Steele novels? I have no clue, but it must be somebody, right?
Tom Clancy turned into alternate history too when the Soviet Union broke up. So,
yeah, he really missed a step with Rainbow Six by putting it in like 2002, and it's still operating on like Soviet era terrorism.
Oh man, no, things like that are the best, right? Like we're like 4 years past Blade Runner now. It's amazing.
Yeah. The only thing I liked of the 2049 one is that they kept the CCP as a thing. Like they weren't going to try and retcon all the incongruities with the passage of time.
Yeah, no, that was a good detail for sure. I'm less hard on that movie than a lot of people seem to be, but I like that they didn't do that. You got like the ballet ads and stuff. You're like, oh, the Russians are still around, or rather, the Soviets. The Russians are still around.
Well, for now.
You know, yeah.
Well, Pavlo, John, that's why in Dead Six, I tried not to get into any details about the helicopter stuff, because at the time, the only helicopter I ever ridden in was a couple of rides in an old Huey when I was in the National Guard, flying by some old Vietnam era pilots. We were like below treetop level, which is really fun, but I have no idea if that's what like a contemporary helicopter ride is like. So I just kind of cut out the whole part where they were actually doing stuff, and then just got to the landing.
Well, I've actually jumped out of a Huey a few times. That gets
on purpose, or
yes, with a parachute even.
Well, that's good.
You kind of have to make sure you heave yourself out at the same time so you don't hit the skid and go ass over tea kettle through your risers.
See, I just got to ride in the CH-53s, the 46, and the 22 Ospreys. So none of them have like side doors that you can exfil out of. So if things start going helicopter-ish, you better hope you're by the door, because oh man, I've been on a lot of hard landings, as it were.
It's like my first time I rode in a shit hook in Afghanistan. It was at night, and I thought we crashed. We landed so hard. We actually had to go back to Kandahar Airfield to get the wheels inspected because they put out kind of a hard landing. They damaged them a little bit. And things like riding in a very loud bus. And it's about the size of a bus.
It's nice compared to its little brother, the 46.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, because they're still building. Chinooks. They built the last CH-46 in like the 60s or 70s, and
Yeah.
And the Marines,
Every time thought that thing was going to rattle itself apart around me.
But speaking of Clancy, that was like the one line that he got right, is that helicopters don't fly. They just vibrate so violently that the ground rejects them.
If the wings are moving faster than the fuselage, it is therefore a helicopter and therefore unsafe. But no, probably my worst helicopter story was a helocast off the coast of Hawaii, where when we put the boat in, the ramp was in the water. By the time I went out, we were 15 feet up and drifting back over the boat.
So are you like trying to not hit the boat because the water would be softer? Yeah.
Yeah.
The
You don't want to
helocast sucks too, because you just have like all the stinging drops of water. It's like a million needles going into you.
Yep. And that's provided you landed right in the first place.
Yeah. But so this brings up a good point that we can wrap back into world building. Inventing new tech that's not so magically out there. Like you're just trying to do like the next step up. How would you go around doing that? Do you just decide it's like, what would I like to see in the next iteration? Or like, how do you square that into, and does that drive the world building elements around it? Or is it driven by stuff that you've already sort of put into place?
Some of it, if you're traditionally published, some of it might be what your editor asks for. Because I've had editors ask me, like, could you make this a little bit more future-y? Right? Because I had described the vehicle as a helicopter, and it was on a colony on another planet in the future. And like, could you make this a little bit more future-y? Because it just, people might think it's out of place. I was like, okay, so I turned it into like a VTOL aircraft, like a jump jet, right? The helicopter would have worked though.
Yeah.
But I was imagining it like a ducted fan type helicopter, which is kind of more future-y, but.
Well, that's the problem with helicopters. You know, you fall back on the if it ain't broke, don't fix it thing, but like helicopters are always broke. So like, if we had any better system than a helicopter, we would use it by now. But
there are like 3 helicopter people in our chat right now too, so you're just antagonizing them.
Well, that, you know what? Payback's a bitch.
So it depends on that. I mean, for me, aesthetics is a big part of it, and I have in my mind, I have an idea of what I want my setting to just look and feel like technology wise, and I try to just go outward from there and kind of retcon to how they got to that level, why it looks like that, why the technology is where it is. And oftentimes it ends up being, well, technology just didn't advance quite as fast as we thought it did, or just kind of stagnated for a while. Because if you want to write a setting where you have like a bunch of space colonies and stuff, that's going to take some time. But if you also don't want to write about like the super advanced post-singularity world that we could barely understand, technology might need to slow down a little bit if you want to have that. So I end up having that. But for me, yeah, aesthetics drives it a lot, and depending on the kind of story you want to tell.
Yeah, no, I don't have as much experience with trying to grow out of now, because my setting is like so far out there. And this was a very conscious choice on my part, because I, aside from playing Call of Duty, right, I had, no experience jumping out of helicopters. I've been told that's the same.
Oh yeah, it is.
But
I was this close to getting a tactical nuke in Helmand, so.
No, yeah, totally. I've survived many nuclear weapons, actually, personally, just like Indiana Jones. But in any case, right, like I don't have the same wealth of experience that certain other writers might have to pull on in my personal life or in like my professional life either, right? So you have to figure out, again, like I said, dude, you have to know your limitations as a writer, right? Both in terms of knowledge, but also in terms of craft. Like what can you do successfully? And so rather than work on like how can I make like a slightly cooler helicopter, I have a lot more sort of latitude in terms of like what the aesthetics get to be. So like Mike, I'm pretty driven by like how cool is it, but also like how sort of culturally consistent is the society that I'm building, right? This is the sort of thing that you'd see reflected in things like architecture, right? So you've got a culture maybe that is supposed to be descended in some form from, let's say, Persians, right? We've been talking about the Persians a fair bit on this. Then that will sort of select for you, the kinds of buildings maybe you want to work with, and you can sort of by the same process, right? That you maybe design a slightly better helicopter. You figure out what does medieval Persian architecture look like scaled up to, skyscraper sized, right? What can we do with that? What words should we use, to describe towers and buildings and things of that nature in order to convey that flavor, but also not alienate the reader too. You don't use too much jargon, but you want to use enough that they like, or at least I want to use enough that like kind of makes them have to think and maybe look up one or two words.
Ziggurat Trade Center 1.
There you go. Yeah. Lots of ziggurats, honestly. But it's a fun word, so it tends to crop up in my writing. But in any case, so there's sort of a similar process there, regardless of how far out your setting is. I guess my point, right? 20,000 years, 2 million years. As long as your story is about people, you're going to be sort of tied to the fact that people need things like doors and vehicles and weapons and clothing and things like that, armor. And there are
Not if you're writing a Samuel Delaney book.
Well, yeah, there's that. But there are only like so many ways that you can do pauldrons, right? Whatever Games Workshop may think. And so you do need to like have some general knowledge, even if you're going to go completely make up, I don't know how some sort of suit of armor works, right? You need to know how armor works, kind of in general, at least in like a very broad sense, right? So it behooves you, I think, as a writer to know a little bit of as much as everything as possible. But oh yeah, Casey's talking about swearing. That's another thing. I'm so sad I wasn't on the panel with Casey about swearing at MarsCon. It sounded awesome. But you do. It goes beyond technology too, though, right? It goes to language, and so swearing is a good example of this. If you've got a culture that maybe is very religious, maybe their oaths would be that way. Ours used to be. I don't know what it says about modern America that we went from having a bunch of religious oaths to basically only fuck. But here we are. So
well, they didn't work on that in the TV show Deadwood. They deliberately used anachronistic swears of. They had more F-bombs per minute than any other TV show in there. People didn't actually talk like that in the 19th century.
No, but saying like "dag on it" and
a lot of the religious-based, curses they used back then would kind of sound silly to a modern audience. They were afraid. So I think having like 15 F-bombs in a row kind of sounds silly too, but I could see where they were getting at.
I like Deadwood a lot, but to this day, it is painful to watch sometimes because it's like if you told a 12-year-old you can swear all you want and you're not going to get in trouble, that's what it would sound like. Where they're using it in ways that like it just doesn't work phonetically.
It was like the South Park movie when they finally say fuck. Fuck, fuckity, fuck, fuck, fuck.
Yeah, no, the Witcher show has the same problem. It's just it just doesn't fit the setting. It's very strange.
From what I understand, that's only one of many problems.
It is perhaps the least of that show's problems. Yes, but it is still a problem. And so like you need to think about these things too, right? Because again, these things all fit together, right? Setting is really composed of 100 little different things. It's climate, it's geography, it's culture, it's demographics, but it's also food and all of these things. And you don't need to know all of that as a writer. This is the thing too. I think that part of the problem with sort of the world building panel, right, is it's like literally this infinite topic. And like, how do you sort of winnow that down into something you can talk about in an hour, 2 hours, whatever? And it's difficult because, we could just talk for 2 hours about how do you do food in a fantasy setting in a way that's like, believable. And like, what do you mean by believable? Tolkien has tobacco. What? Like, they shouldn't have that.
No, I was told that was weed. Okay.
You were lied to.
I know.
But
He even says that in the footnotes. He's like, yeah, this is Nicotania. This is not.
Yeah, it's
This ain't the devil's lettuce.
Yeah, it is totally tobacco. Some there's like some like vague like, oh, the Numenorians brought it from the west, which we got
Potatoes too.
Kind of makes sense. What's that?
Yeah.
You got potatoes too.
Oh yeah, and the potatoes. Yeah, there's a lot of.
He also had like wall clocks in the Shire. Like, first up, the Shire is about 300 years ahead of the future compared to the rest of Middle Earth. So
yeah, that's totally true, right? Well, they have the Gregorian calendar too, right?
Right.
And so you can say like, oh, these are problems, right? But they're like totally not actually. They don't get in the way at all, really. Because it's not what the story is about. And if you're the sort of person who asks the dumb question about the Eagles, you're missing the point. It's not a plot hole. You don't understand what the Eagles are. But
they're their own culture and society, and they have their own problems to worry about.
Yeah, well, they're also basically angels, right? They are spirits in service to the Valar, and you can't just ask God to solve your problems. That's fundamentally the reason. Sometimes, he helps you out, but
they specifically only help Gandalf out too, because he is aligned with them in the service to the Valar. It's not like they'll just show up to help the Rohirrim. It's like after the fight with the Balrog, the Eagles come and save Gandalf because the Valar have just said like, hey, no, he's back. Go get him.
Yeah. And he's, with them anyway, right? So
and it's Manwë, and it's specifically who is the Lord of the Eagles, as I recall. They're his.
Yes. He's Lord of the Airs, right? So yeah. Sort of the Saint Michael, as it were. But there's a reason here, but like none of that stuff sort of gets in the way, because I think the tendency is writers get kind of paralyzed, especially like first time writers, to like, wait a minute, I can't write a fantasy book if I don't have 27 made up languages. Like, no, actually, you need 0. You don't need to do any of the same things. You can be interested in something else, I keep reading the comments and losing my train of thought. The bad habit,
it's like internet rule number 1.
Yeah, I know. I'm usually good about it. It's on live streams. I get distracted. But in any case, you don't actually need to know everything. I remember when I worked for Bain, I interviewed Lois McMaster Bujold, right? And I was asking her questions because there's like a pretty obvious retcon in her Vorkosigan books about how the Seed of Gandalf Empire works. And I was asking her, I think, about that, and she said, well, usually, all I do is I make a rule and I stick to it, like you were saying, Mike. But I only make the rules as I need them so that I can, write books. And hearing that from Bujold was very comforting, right? Because she's been at it a while and quite successfully, and it worked depending when it worked. I was like, oh, something on my screen moved. But in any case, that I think is useful because, we tend to, especially if you're trying to write a fantasy, you look at Tolkien's example. And, he worked for like all of his life to write 2 books, essentially. Right? His Lord of the Rings is 1 book, and the other ones, didn't come out until, after he was dead. And like, that's actually not the model you want to emulate necessarily if you're trying to like make a career of this. You don't want to be Tolkien, and you can anyway, actually. Right. So, you should do something else.
First
basically.
of all, no editor is going to let you write omniscient narrator anyway. So
not these days.
Same Dune did it also, and you can't do that anymore.
Yeah, but all right, here's the thing. Dune Frank Herbert could not find a publisher. He had to go to a instruction manual publisher in order to get his book published.
That is true.
All right. So it's like, even back then, if you weren't Tolkien, they weren't letting you do this.
Well, and honestly, Dune was a little, because he would head hop like mid-scene, right? Like this person was thinking this, and then this person was, and yeah, I can see how that can kind of be confusing to the reader, because it's like, Oh, okay, we're just hopping perspectives here, back and forth, back and forth.
I got some bad news for you. Dune is kind of confusing.
But,
Yeah, oh, it totally is.
but here's,
I've
but
oh,
here's
go
the
ahead,
thing
Mike.
now, for the reason people want to try to do omniscient narrator is because if you're thinking cinematically, like if you picture things in your head like it's a movie, that's how movies are. They're kind of omniscient narrator for the most part, right? You just see the camera pointed at different people, and if you think visually, like I do, and like a lot of people do, that's kind of how you tend to think of things. It also gives you a lot more freedom because, well, the camera could be over here, then it could sweep to over this, and then you can sweep to this. Well, that could be a lot harder to follow when you're just describing things because they can't see what's going on in your head. So that's why for like new writers, I tell them, think of your perspective as your camera pointed at one person per scene, right? You can zoom out. It's like a third person game, right? You can zoom out, but it's always pointed at them. It's what they see and what they're thinking.
I mean, yeah. Which is why a lot of people go for first person. I think everybody here, minus myself, has written in first person for like a majority of their work.
Yeah, I definitely have.
Yeah.
About half anyway.
Yeah, that's not to say that omniscient can't work successfully. It's definitely out of style. My experience in talking to like new Dune readers, because this is one of the weird things for me is I've gotten a lot of readers, particularly to go read like Gene Wolfe. They'll hear me talk about him and they'll go and read a much more famous novel and be like, Christopher, like thanks for introducing me to this bigger writer. Which is very strange. But with the Dune readers, they're like, this omniscient thing, it's usually the thing they bounce off of more than like, I don't understand what's going on. It's, I don't like the way that this is written. It spoils the Dr. Yui thing, which people are like, why in God's name would you ever do that? This is sort of touching on a thing that I've been thinking about in regards to writing generally, which is that all of these genres and really science fiction and fantasy in general are sort of ossifying, right? They're just turning into like one thing, you see this in part in the tendency of writers like myself to just borrow and recycle old ideas and touchstones and these things. But even the conventions of how the stories are told are sort of starting to crystallize. Like there are sort of memeplexes that basically just exist inside of fantasy, right? Like the idea of like witch burnings in the Middle Ages is totally a fantasy thing. That is not real life at all.
Or a German thing.
Yeah, well, it happened a little bit later, though, right?
Yeah.
It happens in like early modernity. It doesn't happen in the Middle Ages. And people go around with ideas they get from fantasy, acting like they're like, oh, I saw Game of Thrones. Like I know what England was like. Actually, it was nothing like Westeros.
Yeah.
You
mean it wasn't gray and everybody wasn't covered in mud and shit?
Yeah, to be fair, that's the show's fault. If you like look at the like pre-show stuff for Game of Thrones, it's actually like pretty aesthetically high Middle Ages. Actually, I would have much preferred to get the John Piccaccio art version of Westeros than what we got. But yeah, like people totally they think that it looks like that. And that's not to say that there aren't other details that like actually you couldn't just dump shit wherever you wanted. That was illegal. People didn't like that in 1300.
Well, so that's the main reason that we think it was like that is because we're reading the criminal citations of the people that actually did it.
Right.
And we like people see that and they're like, oh, I guess they just dumped their crap outside the window onto the street. It's like, no, one person did. Florida woman did that and she got arrested for it and fined and put in the stocks. So
yeah, well, exactly, right.
They didn't know about germs, but they knew that poop stank. I mean, it's
and they could observe that, hey, whatever the cause is, people around this filth are getting sick.
Yeah, which is why they had the reason we have the pinky out thing for drinking all fancy and that stuff is because your pinky was the communal finger for like the seasonings and that stuff. So you would have to wash your hands before the meal, and you would have to keep very specific digits clean the entire time. Because they didn't have germ theory, but they knew when you were being unsanitary or not. They knew that if you boiled water, it would be safer to drink. Not everybody drank ale the entire friggin' time. Okay.
Interestingly enough, towards the late 19th century, when they were still trying to figure out, I mean, before the invention of the microscope, there really was no way to confirm that germs were a thing, you know? But so they had a theory that it was like just bad air, bad humors coming off of these things. Well, that theory was wrong, but it was enough to kind of get modern sanitation going to where it really did cut down on the diseases and the but that wasn't medieval England. That was like industrial era 19th century England.
Yeah, it's funny that we laugh at bad air though, but what is an airborne germs?
Basically, yeah.
Yeah,
Bad air.
they're functionally right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing is that you get these nerds who can't distinguish between technically right and functionally right.
Right.
That
Right, because
Well,
it makes people feel
technically-
special to have a little fact, right? And that makes them, better than
they're
people
the
who don't know
actually
the thing.
name.
Yeah, yeah, the meme.
Well, it was like that was with the Austrian maternity ward. I forget the name of it, but so there was like one hospital that had like a severely increased maternity deaths, right? Like the baby would die and the mother would die, even though they had the most sophisticated and advanced doctors. But whenever a doctor would deliver a baby, the death rate would increase, as opposed to if they just had a wet nurse or the maternity nurses do that. And it took an inconveniently long time to realize it was because this was one of the most advanced hospitals, and the doctors were doing cadaver work and teaching hospital stuff with dead bodies, and then going straight to the maternity ward to deliver babies.
Oh,
And so then they had to figure out, it's like, hey, you have to wash your hands before you come,
oh shit.
help this woman give birth. So I forget when that was. It was like I want to say like at least mid 1700s. I'm not sure on the date, and I don't know the name, but I know that story. So
Yeah, but there are a lot of these sort of world building misconceptions that get sort of imported from bad history or just sort of spun up by fantasy writers whole cloth, and then because this is one of the reasons that I don't read a lot of modern fantasies, because it's based on the previous generation's fantasy, which is based on previous fantasy before you get back to anything sort of grounded in actual stuff. So like the whole idea of for example, again, like the witch burning stereotype happening in some medieval village, like it's not real. And so when I see that in a fantasy book, that's one of the things that sort of trips me up, because I know that people are coming away from this thinking that it is somehow reflective of reality, right? And of course there were witch burnings, but they are way rarer than people think, and two happen much later as a general rule. But when you see things like that sort of stuff trips me up. And then of course, someone like my dad will be like, well, it's not real, so why do you care? But like, shut up, basically.
Oh yeah, I love how your world doesn't have to make sense as long as it's fantasy.
Yeah, as long as it's
elves don't exist, therefore societal barriers and boundaries don't exist.
Well, I mean, I guess you could argue that if your setting has actual witches, then witch burning might have been more common.
Right. Well, sure. Or justified even.
There's actually some interesting historical context on the whole witch burning thing. In the laws published by Charlemagne for the Saxon territories after he conquered the Saxons, one of those laws was that if anyone burned someone on suspicion of being a witch, they were to be executed. Because witches don't exist, and you're just murdering people.
Yeah, I was going to say, it wasn't like the witch burnings. It was more of it started off more as a pagan thing. Is because they thought that this stuff was real. So it's like this weird hermit in the woods is obviously, practicing black magic.
And how much of the picture of pre-Christian Europe or anywhere else that gets kind of turned into these fantasy cultures, religions, etc., is actually based on a bunch of spiritualist nonsense from the 19th century.
Well, that's totally true too.
I blame the Rosicrucians. But
yeah, among others.
yeah, among others. But which well, that's like oh shit. Oh yeah, Mark Twain popularized the armor is so heavy that you need to get a crane to put a knight onto his horse. As opposed to, well, armor is like 50 pounds, which is lighter than most modern, Marines and soldiers carry on their back. And it's all around your body. So it's actually way easier to move in that stuff. Now, a lot of those comparisons, they're talking about like full movement gear, like you've got your ILB and everything, as opposed to just your combat load. But it's like that's where we get like, oh, real swords are so heavy that you can't really swing them. It's like, no, it's like 3 pounds, and most of that's in the handle.
Yeah, and tops too, right? Like that's a pretty big sword. Yeah. So what I guess the point in mentioning all of this is to counterbalance the bit earlier where we're like, just like make up your own rules and be consistent. Like there are things that you like probably shouldn't do, right? You shouldn't maybe have every sword be too heavy, right? Like you should know that actually, for example, I remember there's a YouTuber, Shadiversity, right? He does a lot of medieval weaponry stuff. He did a video once about like what is a like a good weapon to like give a peasant girl, right? And he's like, oh, like actually a long sword is a much better choice than a long bow because she doesn't have the draw strength for that. But the tendency in fantasy is like if you have a female character in the party, like she's the archer for some reason, right?
Well, that's the gamification. That is because D&D puts strength as your attribute for sword fighting and dexterity for shooting a bow.
It actually takes a lot of strength to draw. I mean, it's not just with. I mean, I've never really used a bow, but I remember reading about the making of Rambo 4. And the modern bow that he had in there was like a 90-pound draw.
Yeah.
Right? There was a scene where he held it back, pointed at somebody's face. You're like, that's not somebody your little waif girl in your party is going to be able to do.
Oh, I love it when fantasy movies and all that stuff, they have like the guy's constantly drawn back and he's just ready to let it loose. And like, no, dude, you've got about like 10 seconds before that starts to
before it's going.
Not to mention
especially at war strength, because I have a 100-pound compound bow, and so that it loses a lot of its draw tension. Well, it keeps the tension, but the weight drops because of the cams when you pull back, and it's still a bitch. So
yeah. So like you need to know these like basic facts. Like you can't just like you shouldn't reinvent how gravity works.
Yeah,
basic gravity. You got artificial gravity.
No. We totally should. Gravity as it is sucks.
If you're going to write fantasy with weaponry that's equivalent to some historical period in the real world, do yourself a favor and go research how that weaponry was actually used. Yeah. Right? You don't have to. You can do whatever you want, but I think it'll be better as a work, and you'll feel better about it if you actually base it in reality. Your readers will be like, wow, this guy kind of knows what he's talking about. And you'll use the way it was for a reason, because that's how it worked. That's how it logically made sense.
Plus, your hero should be using halberds and pole arms and all that stuff. That needs to become a trend now.
I still want to know exactly what the halberd was that was described in Njál's saga.
I mean, I don't know enough about that, but I do think, because functionally speaking, the sword was more of a sidearm. It's what you used after your main weapon went down. So it's more like your handgun rather than your rifle. So which in modern like techno thriller action thriller stuff, when the main guy, your character goes to their sidearm, now shit got real. So thematically speaking, it works in fantasy if they have to go to their sword rather than starting with that.
I think people like swords because it's more personal, it looks cool, but I'm pretty sure that for most of ancient history up until fairly recently, like the spear or some variation of it was the primary infantry weapon.
Oh yeah.
Well,
Right up until the invention of that's why
way past the invention of firearms.
That's why early rifles were 4 feet long, had a foot long bayonet on them too, because they could use it as a pike against cavalry. So
there was one particular army where the spear was not the primary, and that was the Roman legions. It was close on the enemy, throw the pila, then close with the short swords.
Right, but the Roman shield was basically the primary weapon at that point. You could argue that the Spartans had the same mindset, but they still focused on the spear with the phalanx.
Yeah.
So the Romans were just like, take away the reach.
Yeah. I think part of the attraction of the sword, though, right, is that we have such a strong tradition in the West of magic swords, right, and famous swords, because they are personal weapons, right? So, they're also very expensive weapons, too, relative to producing a spear, right? There's way more metal involved. And so they tended to be the weapons of, kings and famous characters, right? And so if you have an Arthur or a Charlemagne, right, Charlemagne's got,
Yeah, Joyeuse.
Joyeuse, yeah.
Roland had
Durandal, yeah, and then
there was
you've
Cortana.
got and Cortana, and then you've got El Cid's got his swords whose names escape me. I think he has 2, which are real, which is cool. But then you've got obviously you have Excalibur, right? And then there are a bunch of other ones, and because of that, I think, and because those are the foundational texts that a lot of fantasy is drawing on, either directly or by way of telephone, right? We have this sort of tendency to sort of put the sword in its central place. So too, right, with like the Japanese stuff, right? Because the katana is the symbolic weapon of the samurai, right? There's this speaking of studying the blade.
I want to see a mystical arquebus.
That'd be cool.
It just keeps reloading on its own.
Well, the other thing to consider with some of these old stories with these named swords, how many of those characters fought in a shield wall or in a formation with a bunch of other warriors? They didn't. All those stories, when you're seeing these weapons in action, they're hero fights.
Champions, right?
They're champion on champion.
Yeah, Aristia, the Greeks.
Champion on monster or what have you.
Yeah,
so this is that to be taken into consideration too.
You want to talk about someone who is bad world building? Actually, well, let's pick on Homer for a second, because Homer has never seen anybody use a chariot because they.
Well, he's never seen anybody. Period.
Well, that's true. Nice. But the Iliad is very confused about the function of chariots in warfare, right? They are basically taxis that the princes and the Achaeans roll up in to then get off of and have fights, right? They do not get used properly in the Iliad, actually, which I think is very funny. And that's because there's about a 500-year gap between when the events of the Iliad might have taken place and Homer's writing about it. Or Homer's writing about it, depending on whether or not you're a Homer truther. But in that 500 years,
this is all lies.
Yeah, but not all lies. Actually, Zeus did wipe out the city with an earthquake, and by Zeus I mean there was an earthquake.
You mean, but next you're going to tell me it wasn't all written in rhyming English?
Yeah, very sorry. That's
no, it was. They just changed it to sell you on Big Greek.
Big Greek. The dactylic hexameter is where it's at, let me tell you. But in that 500 years, they stopped using chariots, more or less, right? So, like, they know they exist. Obviously, they use them for sport, but the whole idea that you would be using them as archery platforms is something that has not occurred to the poet, right? So, of all things that has bad technical world building, the Iliad. It uses chariots, which is great. So it's okay to get stuff wrong. You could still be a foundational text of the Western canon and have bad world building. Some nerd's going to call you out on 3,000 years later. Yeah,
Beowulf got it all right, though.
That's true.
And this can extend into your science fiction stuff too. And a lot of stuff we were talking about before about like how tropes and just like memes have just become canonized now. Christopher, you mentioned that, and that's true. There's a trope of the standard human fleet of their boxy gray spaceships with rocket engines on the back that look like the ships from Halo or any other sci-fi game or sci-fi show or whatever. And that's kind of what people tend to think it's going to look like. And that like spaceships are going to be analogous to naval ships somehow. And that, because that's the closest thing we have to kind of really compare them to, but you don't have to make it like that if you don't want to. There were some people who teach at like war colleges and at least one congressman who got super butthurt when it was the Space Force and didn't have like Navy ranks. And he wrote like an op-ed how it should be have Navy ranks because of Star Trek. That was his justification.
Of course.
The Space Force doesn't even have
He
anybody.
sounds like a great
space.
thinker.
They don't even have anybody in space, much less starships. Okay, but
the thing about the standard human fleet, I've actually had somebody try to tell me, dead serious is a heart attack. Well, we'll have artificial gravity by that time, so there will be so naturally we'll have the gravity along an axis perpendicular to the line of thrust, which makes zero sense.
Now, like for world building, in my particular case, I don't like having artificial gravity in my set. I think it makes space seem like less like space, right? If you're just like riding around in like a luxury liner like Picard, drinking your tea Earl Grey hot. So
Exploring space in your living room. Come on, man. It's the
wearing pajamas
in your pajamas
the whole time, right? In your gym jams. It's comfy, right?
Seinfeld is so great.
Sip your tea. But you have a humongous bedroom on your starship. So even in my current work in progress, which is set roughly in the 3400s, you don't have that technology because there's no way to make that happen. That would cause all kinds of second, third order effects. Like if you could make gravity, you would make warping really, it would cause problems. So they don't have it. You have gravity on your ship if you're under thrust. If you're thrusting at roughly 1G, then you have gravity because the decks are perpendicular to the axis of thrust. If you're not, then you don't. Some larger ships might have like a rotating section that folds against the hull when you're underway. And then when you're coasting, you can fold them out and spin it. You kind of want to have it be able to twist though like that, because otherwise it's going to be spinning and then you're going to hit the thruster and then everybody's going to be like pinned in a corner because it's gotten two angles of thrust on there.
Yeah, that's actually one thing I wish I'd done. I wish I'd done not done the artificial gravity, just because the axis of thrust thing is cooler.
It's one of those things that it's so codified into science fiction. A lot of people don't even think about it anymore. Yeah. I never did but it's also really limiting in a lot of ways, right? Like you can't have like the cool little starship, like the little tramp ship that can fly around and land on planets and have like a tiny crew.
I was going to say, in Star Wars, it kind of makes more sense than like, say, Star Trek, because in Star Trek, the big capital ships, they never go into the atmosphere, right? They're always in orbit and they're always in free fall. In Star Wars, though, spaceships are just planes that can fly in space, or they're aircraft and spacecraft, right? So they have to function as both. And when you're on the surface and in the atmosphere, you do have that perpendicular flight plan.
Which can also make designing the ship that lands kind of difficult, because if you want a ship that lands, you're going to end up trying to make it a tail lander, which is okay. It's cool. You got yourself a nice Heinlein rocket ship or like Elon Musk's Starship, right?
Until you get a strong crosswind.
Or then you need 100-foot crane to unload the thing. Whereas something that lands like an airplane, you can just lower a ramp and then just drive a forklift onto it. So, yeah, you think about things like that. And if you set it farther in the future, though, you can think about how would this technology evolve over time? How would they adapt to this over, hundreds or even thousands of years? If that's a law of the universe, and that isn't going to change ever. So maybe they find different workarounds. Maybe they adapt in innovative ways. And that's a personal quirk of mine. I'm not trying to write hard science fiction, really, but there are some things I like to shout out the physics a little bit, you know.
No, but flying buildings are pretty cool in their own right, though.
It's not hard science fiction, but I like to wave at physics as I fly by.
Yeah, I'm the same way.
There's no reason not to have a certain degree of realism. I mean, it's not an either or sort of proposition.
And
Right.
I mean, even the most space opera does. Like even Star Wars had hyperdrive, instead of having everybody just fly from planet to planet, right? Even they understood that you had to go faster than light to get anywhere in a reasonable amount of time. They didn't get into all the stuff about how it's technically going backwards in time if somebody else is going relativistic speeds and it happens to be observing you, and stuff will make your brain melt. But you don't necessarily need to.
Right.
I did because I hate myself. Yes, so
It's all right. We hate you too.
I know. That's fair. I understand.
Well, we're starting to get towards the 2.5 hour mark, so we should probably start wrapping this up a little bit.
Like I said, I could get the guys chat. If you're here for the long haul, I can get these guys going again, talk about Tolkien again. We can be here till like 3 a.m.
That is true, but then I will miss my deadline by even more. And Tony will kill
still
me.
have work to do, including you, Mike.
Yeah, we were actually hired by your competition to distract you from submitting the next book.
I don't have. Bold of you to think I'm important enough to have competition.
I was talking to Chris.
Oh,
Yeah, your check is in the mail.
Penguin with some inside jokes.
if it's from
Oh,
Bay,
yeah.
you get a can of cat food as rewards, or a can of tuna as rewards. So you know.
Yeah, how do you factor in the free will when it's all differential German equations?
You tell Germans to stop doing philosophy, and
They're
yeah.
not equipped for it.
Yeah.
Has it ever worked out well for them?
No.
Has it ever worked out well for the rest of us?
No.
Yeah, I can't think of one.
So, Christopher, plug your book. What are you working on right now? What do you got coming out?
All right, so the next major book is going to be Disquiet Gods, which is book 6 in the Sun Eater series. It's coming out in like April of next year, so there's a bit of a wait on that. I did just have book 5 come out, Ashes of Man. This is the one series we won't be talking about the whole time that I have. So if you would like to read a space opera in the tradition of Dune with a bit of a Star Wars flavor to it and a little bit of Gene Wolfe on the side, I'm your guy. The first book is Empire of Silence. You can check that out basically wherever books are sold. It's out in mass markets and ebook, of course, and audio. The hardcover, as everyone reminds me every other day, is out of print. I know that it does not appear to be coming back into print, so paperback is the way to go. But I also have a YouTube channel. I'm over at Sun Eater Books. If you want to come on by, I do sort of Q&A live streams about writing and about my work at least once a month. I'm trying to do some more stuff too, but the rest of it has to wait until after I survive finishing book 6, which hopefully will be another week or so. So thanks for having me, guys. It's great.
That was great having you, brother.
Mike, Coop, anything to push?
No,
Just like stuff.
I'm still working on the same thing I've been working on since we've been doing these, so I'll finish it and then, yeah.
Pete, what about you?
Yeah, what are you working on, Pete?
Well, the second Paul's group book, The Dragon and the Skull, is in the can, at least as far as ebook and print go. Things are rolling for audio. That'll probably be coming out a little bit after the ebook and print do. But this is one of the first series, the second series really. The Lost was the first one where I've had audio as well as print and ebook coming as the series progresses. So that will be the 28th for print and ebook, and TBD on the audio. And in the meantime, I'm working on, as I said, the 7th and I believe plan to be last Order of the Centurion book for Galaxy's Edge.
Nice. Cool.
Awesome.
What are you going to do with your life? Do you even know?
Which one? Become a hobo and just phone in these from now on.
Eh,
No, I had all my money wrapped up in some Silicon Valley bank, so it's not looking too hot, guys.
well,
So,
the governor of California called in a favor for you. So
Yeah, I don't think I'm getting bailed out on that. I never went to the island.
ooh. And on that note, as before the assassins come for Coop.
Is that Valentine?
Do you hear a helicopter?
No, you don't. They're the special ones.
We'll see y'all next month.
Bye, guys.